Welcome to the podcast. This episode is slightly different from my usual radio interviews or Dark Tales vignettes. I want to introduce you to a couple of special buildings on the Callan Park site at Rozelle. For those of you who don't know, Callan Park was a hospital for the mentally ill, and it ran from the late 1880s through to 2008. The heart of Callan Park is what we know as the Kirkbride, which is a collection of sandstone buildings which were developed in 1885. But they became quickly overwhelmed with patients. And so, as Royal Commissions into the conditions at the Callan Park site got underway in the late 1950s through the 60s and beyond, these buildings were built to take the overflow from the Kirkbride and to provide people who were patients at the site with sweeping views across the parkland and Iron Cove beyond. Ward 17 and Ward 18, you may know them. They're at the top of the hill, in the middle of the site, mirror image buildings, and they both have exquisite bay windows, offering the patients within those sweeping views. Unfortunately, they are scheduled for demolition this year, which is a real shame because they did play a significant role in psychiatric and mental health care in New South Wales and Australia in the 1960s. This was after the moral hygiene period of rest and work and good environment gave way to a psychiatric and drug-based mode of care. These wards were spacious and airy and allowed the patients to have privacy when they needed to and to be together if they wanted to. They housed some of the older patients at Callan Park, those that didn't really have a chance of ever being released from the hospital site. And they're very striking looking buildings, along with the wonderful bay windows. You have exquisite glazed terracotta tile roofs, which really make those buildings. And until recently, they have actually been used in television productions, particularly for Channel 9 miniseries, so Doctor Doctor and Love Child. They were both filmed in those wards. So going back to when these wards 17 and 18 were built, there was 1,824 patients at Callan Park, so 1,824. And they were housed within that Kirkbride, which originally was designed only for around 800. So it was more than double full. And after the public inquiry and the production of the Stoller report in the mid-1950s, which reported on the conditions of psychiatric hospitals, it recommended that these wards were built alongside other buildings, such as the admissions building, Ward 16 next to them, and then Ward 12 on the corner. Unfortunately, these buildings haven't lasted too well. As soon as the asylum was closed in 2008, people got in and stripped the beautiful copper roofing over the entryways and any copper that they could get from the roof spaces, so they haven't been exactly watertight since. And after filming in Ward 18, it seems to have been quite battle scarred. So there was a small fire there, and also a hole in the roof has appeared, which is a real shame. I'd like to play you a clip of a man called Graham Curry, who worked there as a healthcare practitioner in the 1970s. He was interviewed by Rosalind Burge from Friends of Callan Park, so I'll put that clip in about an interesting patient that was there. But he also talked about Ward 18 more generally as being one of the worst wards to be sent to, apparently. You could actually smell the faeces and the urine to the heavens as you arrived on the ward. There are about 40 patients there who are quite profoundly incapacitated with mental illness. And he said as he started as a student nurse on that ward that a lot of the other staff spent most of their time in the tea room ignoring the patients. And the patients were largely incontinent. But he actually began to start empowering these patients, taking them to the toilet on a rota all day, every day. And he actually helped them regain continence. And within a few weeks, virtually none of those patients were incontinent because somebody was actually providing them with the opportunity to take control and not be incontinent. And here is another story from Graham.
The patients who were challenging or difficult, or the patients that most other people didn't like to work with. I was always there for a bit of a challenge, I suppose, and the people who people couldn't make any sense out of, I felt that I could, if one sat with a person long enough, one could make a lot of sense out of what appeared to be a lot of nonsense.
What other wards are you thinking of as you talk about this?
Well, I'm actually going to go back to Ward 18 and give an example of a man who would come along and he'd say, he'd touch parts of people's clothing and would say number 23, and then he'd touch another part of somebody's clothing and say 26, or he'd touch the wall and say 37 or whatever. And I discovered, and people thought, no, this person's just crazy, and I discovered this man used to be a tailor, and so he was actually remembering the numbers for all the colours of fabrics, or he was a very intelligent man who had a lot of knowledge about colours and fabrics and textures and all those things, and here he was locked in this ward with the terrible humiliation of, in those days, people didn't have their own personal clothing. This is even in the mid-70s. Some of them may have had some, but often they were in the wash, and clothing were shared. And I remember even this particular man having to wear, during the day, maybe a non-matching set of pyjamas.
It really brings it home to you just how many different people found their way into Callan Park Hospital for one reason or another. But while these hospital buildings can be tarred with ghosts of unpleasant memories, of horror and abuse, there are also lots of stories of goodness, of safety and refuge in the asylum and care. So, as I said, Ward 17 and Ward 18 are not going to be around for a whole lot longer. I really urge you to go and pay them a visit. They're really striking buildings, and if you feel the urge that you don't want to see them go, which I think many of us don't want to see them go because they are so striking. You can approach right to your local MP or the minister and try and get that overturned.